as one of the most important theoreticians about the development of the world, and by Foreign Policy magazine as the Latin American who will have the most influence. So it is a very great pleasure to me to introduce Hernando de Soto, who will, let me just say one other thing, there will be passing out the document that he has prepared, his group, the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, has prepared. So it is a great pleasure to me to introduce Hernando de Soto, who I believe will be talking to us about a project that they have done for the IDB, looking at this whole issue of the unlocking the dead assets and providing legal protections for businesses. Hernando?
Thank you very much for your kind words, Richard. I think this is a great date. I think it's a great opportunity, the one that Luis Alberto Moreno has served to us this morning when he talks about building the opportunity for the majority. And I could think of no better way to illustrate that than writing on the reflections of my friend Carlos Slim regarding China. I mean, here we have an absolutely booming country that has been reaching growth rates of about 10% a year, has been displacing export markets like nobody has, but still divided in two. You've got 1,300,000,000 Chinese, and the people that are participating in this revolution, which has given the whole country a 10% growth rate, are about 250 million. Those on the East Coast, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Canton, Hong Kong. But at the interior of the country, at the bottom of the pyramid, are about 1,050,000,000 people who are not participating in all of that. As a matter of fact, just recently, China surpassed Brazil as the country with the highest Gini factor, I think, in the world, which is the distance between the rich and the poor. In other words, what I'm saying, it's always easy to get that first 20, 30% inside the market economy. The real challenge is how you get that other 70%. And that's why what Carlos Alberto was saying to us today, what Luis Alberto was saying to us today, was, I want to get to the bottom of the pyramid. I want to give opportunity to that majority. Because we Latin Americans have been on track in terms of market economies. We have been freeing up our markets. We have been stabilizing our money issue. We have been reducing our fiscal deficits ever since we got our independence from Spain. And continually we swerve to one side of the pendulum, and then somebody comes back and says it isn't reaching the majority. And then we go back to populist regimes. That's the history of Latin America. And a banker and historian of Colombia, Junguito, as a matter of fact, described that between 1820 and today, we have swung 5 times from one side to the other, and we're swinging again. So the real issue is not how do you get a minority that becomes prosperous, that gets high GNP per capita, like China today, like India today, but how do you make sure that people at the bottom get it? Not that it trickles down, but that they too can participate. So it's a momentous task. It's quite an agenda that Ambassador Moreno has placed himself in. And we are only too glad to help in this direction because we strongly believe in that. We have done a study at the request of both the Inter-American Development Bank and FOMIN, the Multilateral Investment Fund, part of the family, to look at 12 Latin American countries, and you have probably got a sheet in front of you, which I will be basing the rest of my speech in, which looks like this. This is exactly it. That tells you how over the last months, in a jointly financed effort, we went to 12 Latin American countries. They're the ones outlined there: Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, and Peru. And we have done what we call a pre-diagnostic. In other words, we've learned a few things after some years, which is a pre-diagnostic of how big we think the legal sector is of this economy. In other words, how many of the people in these countries are legally empowered to take advantage of the market economy that's given to them, both national, inside each country, and both international, what's being offered by World Trade Organization or the free trade agreements with the United States and other parts of the world, or Mercosur, or the local integration agreements. In other words, there's plenty of statistics on the world on who's on $1 a day, who's on $2 a day, who's got malaria, who's got AIDS, but there are no statistics on who is empowered. In other words, what is it that you actually need to be able to create wealth, whatever your social status is? Now, the reply doesn't generally come from the North Atlantic countries, because a lot of what the North Atlantic countries did to create their wealth, they are not totally conscious of, because it came very gradually. For example, in 1850 in New York was the first date that you could actually go out and register a company without it being approved by Congress. In 1870 was the first time in Europe, first with Coquelin, that you could actually go and record a company without the authority of a charter of the king. The idea that anybody can put together a company is relatively a new idea. And it's only about since 1947-48 that this happened in Japan and its two former colonies, Taiwan and South Korea. Since the North Atlantic countries did that, they started adding a whole bunch of other things to what a company could do. And the theory behind this paper that you've got in front of you is that all these tools are the things that allow them to create wealth. In other words, it's not a simple task. It's not that you have a car and then you go. You got to have a car, but it's better have a motor, it better have a carburetor, it better have a gas tank, it better have pistons, it better have a series of machines in it. And what we're going to say is that a lot of the tools that are necessary to build the growth machine are not in place in Latin America. And that is certainly one of the most fundamental ways to get to that basic majority. There are three specific things. The development agenda, as Ambassador Moreno was saying, is a big agenda. But there are some things that are fundamental. As a philosopher, Paul Weiss of the United States, used to say, there are certain things that hang out, that stand out, and that allow you to put everything else in place. There's the whole theory of biological connection that was given by Uxell, how a dragonfly catches a midge. And there you can see that the dragonfly sees the midge, catches it on its retina, it smells the midge, it hears the midge, it can touch the midge, it can taste the midge, and all these five senses are coordinated by what is called a sentient organism in the brain that makes them all come together, and he catches it in full flight. So the question is, if you look at all the books of law in Latin America, we have all sorts of law. Civil code law, we have property law, we have torts law, we have got financial law, we've got international public law, we've got international private law, we've got penitentiary law, we've got criminal law. But the question is, do all these things come at the same time, or do you have to start in one specific area? And we think that there are three areas that you actually have to start. Property rights, business organizations, and identity. And that's where the fact sheet will talk to you about. If you look at the first circle on the fact sheet, it says property, extra-legal urban properties. And here's the question. How many extra-legal properties in these 12 Latin American countries that we have surveyed, and it's an initial pre-diagnostic type of a survey, actually have all the instruments with which to develop? And the reply is about 35%. Let me tell you what those are. First of all, it means having a property right, being inscribed in the records, and having a title that allows you to have sufficient credibility so as to generate credit. In other words, credit, as we Peruvians know, we got to 7,500% inflation back in between 85 and 90. It's not money that creates credit, it's trust. Money, there's always been plenty of anywhere. You can create it as it need be. What you need is credibility. As a matter of fact, the word credit comes from credibility, credere in Latin. I had a recent conversation, or rather a year ago, with a former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Greenspan, and I used to tell you, I asked him if we could talk in a sense that would allow me one day to talk to you as well. I said, Mr. Greenspan, how do you know how much liquidity to put in the market so that there's sufficient credit? And he said, well, I see how the market operates. And I said, how do you see how the market operates? You have a wonderful central intelligence that allows you to see outside the factories how many sofas are going out, how many automobiles are going out, how many bicycles. And he said, no, first of all, our central intelligence isn't that good. And secondly, that's not the way I get my information. So I said, well, how do you get your information? He said, well, the markets. Essentially, I try and find out how many people exchange titles over property in the markets, whether it be the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange. And that exchange of paper gives me an idea of what I need to insert in the market so that the credit is available. I said, now what would happen if you came from countries where only 35% of all physical assets actually had a title to them that could respond to reality? He said, gee, I'd have a problem. How do you put credit into a market like that? And if you look at the rural properties of Latin America, it's 76% of them that don't have a title that can actually produce that information for Mr. Greenspan. So that is one of the reasons that you have no credit. How do you get the credit to people? Do you drop it in helicopters? Do you distribute it in the streets? And Mr. Greenspan said, of course, that's not the way we do it. The way it generally works is that the banks take care of that. They have a set criteria for handing out credit. And so they actually ask somebody for their property as a collateral, or at least as information so that they know that the person that is requesting has got something to lose. There's no credit if you don't have anything to lose. It's an unfortunate law, but that's the way it goes. And you have to find out what their address is. I mean, how can you get a credit if you don't have an address? And I repeat, if you don't have property, you also don't have an address. And then what we at the Federal Reserve do, said Mr. Greenspan, is then when that money comes in, when that evidence comes in from the bank, we then rediscount it. I said, now imagine that you were in a continent where more than 75% of the people didn't have anything to be rediscounted. How do you get your credit in there? He said, I don't know. I don't know either. So property and institutions and giving people not just titles, but titles that produce credit are crucial, and that means getting definitely to the bottom of the pyramid. And once you get that, you also get identity, because as I mentioned before, there is no such thing as identity if you do not have an address. Right now, we Peruvians, for example, are about to approve in our Congress the signing of the Tratado de Libre Comercio, the free trade area with the United States. It's a very important moment, and by the way, I absolutely and totally support it. Now that means that Peruvians, any Peruvian, can, in certain conditions of privilege, only shared by certain other nations, go and export to the United States in unenviable conditions. Our exports will go up, as Mexicans did. So the first thing they're going to do when you have to export, of course, is you have to give a passport to your goods, and you have to sign a bill of lading, un conocimiento de embarque. So first thing you're going to do is sign in and say your name is Suarez. How many Latin Americans, how many Peruvians have got a clear, defined identity that, for commercial purposes, tells you where to go? Second, you're going to be asked, what is your official address? Now, I can already tell you that about only 25% of Peruvians have official addresses. And the third thing you're going to be asked is, what company do you work for? And if you look at your third pie in the fact sheet that was handed to you, basically only about 8% of Latin Americans have actually got a company that can engage in foreign trade, obtain investment, and obtain credit. In other words, when Peruvians, if they get their free trade, and if it is approved by the U.S. Congress, it will be a wonderful opportunity for maybe about 25% of all Peruvians and only 8% of our companies. But not because the United States doesn't want to give it to them, it's because the law in our countries is so restrictive. So when people come around and says, look, it doesn't matter if they're big companies or small companies. It doesn't matter if they're micro companies that don't have these rights. It does. Because it means that they're going to remain micro. It means they're not going to get the big markets. It means they're not going to get the credit. It means they're not going to get the scale.